Welcome to the Kickstart podcast, where we highlight the stories of how professionals kickstarted and navigate their successful careers. My name is Preston, and on this episode, we have the pleasure of hosting someone who started his recruiting career at an agency before working at some of the most well-known, fast-growing tech companies out there in the New York City area. Mitch, thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome. I am more than happy to be here. It's a pleasure to see you again after all these years.
It's been quite some time, but I guess a fitting way to start is handing it over to you. For those that don't know who you are and your background, would you just mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm Mitch. Full name's Mitchell Babineaux. Very French, very Louisiana last name. I'm originally from, like I said, Louisiana, the deep South part, very unknown, scary, swampy part. I moved to New York City, I don't know, I guess it's almost like 10 years ago now. And first job was in the agency space. Had my taste, went into the in-house side after that, worked in the VR space during the VR bubble, if anybody remembers that. Very quickly exited that after 2 years, and sort of meandered my way through a couple of startups. And now today I'm working at Chronosphere. I own the product vertical for recruiting at Chronosphere. So product management, design, tech writing, so on and so forth. Basically, anything that reports to our head of product is my job to hire. And yeah, I mean, I could dive into anything super specific if you want, but I've just been a super technical recruiter, sort of skirting around the space of product management and design for quite a while before finally landing a space where I could actually do it specifically. So yeah.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for the high level summary. Now, a couple of things come to mind. You're from Louisiana, which is super cool. How did you end up in New York, and why New York? Like, why not San Francisco? And also before that, have you always been in tech as well? Like, have you always wanted to like find some sort of job related to the tech world?
Yeah. So I guess the answer to basically all of those questions is no. Well, besides how did I move to New York? So I went to college for design, actually. I have a degree in industrial design specifically, so the creation of like physical goods, products, etc. It's one of the spaces that a lot of like UX designers come from, right? As transitioning into the digital from the physical. And I was very lost after high school. I had literally zero plan. Like even after high school, I had no idea what I wanted to go to school for. I knew I was expected to go to school. I was the first person in my family to like get the opportunity to go to college, but outside of my brother who got that opportunity later in life when he was in the military. And so I knew I kind of had to go to college. And the funny story here is how I picked my college major was we were going in, I think it was trigonometry class. We were going in reverse order. My last name is Babineaux, so I was second to last in front of a guy who had a last name. And the person before me said that they were going to school for architecture. And then when it became my turn, I said, me too. So that's legitimately how I picked my college major. So I had zero plan. Went to school for architecture originally. After about a semester, I figured out about design. Looked a lot easier, a lot more fun. And I went to school for design. And then ended up coming to New York because I spent about 2 years after college just trying to floundering around. I had a girlfriend at the time. She really wanted to move to New York. She was a graphic designer. She wanted to work in the fashion industry. We saved up some money. I followed her very quickly, realized that we no longer wanted to be together. And then after that, I was too headstrong and stubborn and single to want to go back home to Louisiana. So I just made my way in New York. Wow. And as far as like working in tech, as it happens with like most recruiters, I don't think my story is incredibly unique. I just kind of landed in it, right? Like we both come from the agency world. We know how that sort of like works for like entry level, right? Like I could breathe, I could pick up the phone, I could listen to instructions, and they called me back. They were literally, I believe it was Sam over on the Workbridge side. It's the first person to call me back after I was applying, and I just kind of made my way into it. And yeah, the plan was never tech. The plan was never really anything. The plan was just to sort of like find anything that would like take me and have me. And I just so happened to get lucky enough that the first thing that I did, I was actually kind of good at. And so I just kind of rolled with it.
Wow. A degree in design, you moved to New York, and then you stumbled upon recruiting. So when at that time, were you just applying for like any single job that you could find? Because I'm just trying to remember like, and for those that are listening, to give a little context, Mitch and I actually met at this agency. So we both started our career at this agency in New York City. And I was chatting with our old colleagues. Do you remember Joe Walsh?
Back in the day? Remember Joe.
Yeah. So we reconnected, and I was he was sharing with me about his experience. And I remember, I think like I applied for like a sales job. I think I found something on LinkedIn. It was like a sales associate. And then I got a call from JobSpring and like, oh, it's actually like a sales-esque job, but for a full 360 recruiting. They're like, and then they kind of gave me the spiel. They're like, are you interested? I'm like, Kind of like, I guess that kind of sounds cool.
Do
Was
you
it the
pay
same
money?
situation as you? Like, were you applying for a lot of like random sales roles and you just happened to like click apply now for that?
Yeah, kind of. So like I
Mm.
actually applied for a recruiter job. So in the 2 years between graduating college and moving to New York City, I worked, I did a lot of odd jobs in college, and I've always just done a lot of weird things. Like whatever helped pay the bills, I did. I've done pest control, I've run gas stations, I worked at a print shop, like all kinds of different stuff. And so I was always a very like classic Southern, can speak to a wall and have a whole conversation kind of guy. And so when I moved to New York, I was just looking for any job. And my girlfriend at the time was like, very talented graphic designer, found some opportunities very quickly. And I remember we were sitting in our apartment. We had basically enough money to last for 2 months before we just had $0. And so I was desperately trying to find a job. And she was getting calls because she posted her portfolio and her resume on like Indeed and stuff like that. And she was getting calls from these people. And I was like, who is calling you? She's like, I don't know. There's like a recruiter. Like, keep in mind that like we're from South Louisiana. Recruiting is not a thing. I didn't even know it was a job. I didn't know anything about it. And I was like, what do they do? And she's like, they're just talking to me about jobs that they're trying to hire for. And I was like, I could do that. And she's like, yeah, you could probably do that. And so I just went on LinkedIn and literally I saw a couple of recruiter jobs. I just put in my resume. And like I said, I believe Sam King was the first person to call me back. And then I ended up, no, it was actually Sloan. It was Sloan who called me. And then I interviewed with Sam King.
That is amazing. So,
Yeah.
unlike you, Mitch, I'm from New York, and before JobSpring, which is the name of this agency, I did not know that recruiters existed at all.
Mm.
So, like, I quickly kind of had to dive and just learn about this world very quickly. But I think you just had a little foray and just personal curiosity of your then girlfriend's experience. I think that's super funny. So, for those that are just unfamiliar with the agency world, you alluded to it a little bit before, but what was like the do you remember the initial kind of interview process there?
Yeah. I remember it
And
very
just
intimately.
walk hopefully in a good way, maybe in a bad,
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah. It's a
But then
nostalgic experience.
it sure is. And then we'd love to just kind of hear about your experience, like the early days and your time at the agency world for those again that are unfamiliar with that.
Yeah. So the interview process was about as like box standard as I've ever seen an interview process before. It was like classic New York, come to an office, we're not going to tell you anything, but you just got to show up, and then you show up and there's a whole bunch of rules you didn't know about. Then you have to go fix them and come back again. So I remember the first time I had to show up, and I made the right choice of wearing a dress shirt and dress slacks, because I was like, I've never interviewed for a job that wasn't just like someone's friend or like someone knew something. So I was like, okay, this is like a serious thing. It's a big company. They have their own website, which was like a novelty thing for me at the time. And so I got about as dressed up as I could, right? We're talking like everything from like Gap sort of clearance aisle. And I met with them. I want to say I might have actually interviewed with Joe Walsh, who I know you sort of had on this podcast for. I think I might have actually interviewed with Joe Walsh. And I remember I can't remember the specific questions they asked me. They were mostly just about like, how do I like connect with people? Like, how do I talk to people? Like, how do you go about like structuring your day? Like super like standard sort of like generic questions that you get in any interview. And I remember we ended the interview. We were like ending the interview, and they were like, we want you to come back. We want you to meet someone else, but you have to shave. And I remember at the time, like I couldn't even grow facial hair at the time. Like this was a myth in my mind. And I was like, okay. And they were like, how long has it been? I remember them asking me specifically, like, how long has it been since you shaved? And I was like, I don't know, a week. And they're like, you have to shave before you come in. And I was like, I didn't even know I had facial hair. And so I did that. And then I was also told like, hey, try to have a suit jacket next time. And I had to go, I think I went to H&M and bought a suit jacket and came back. And I can't remember how many more interviews I did. I only really remember that first interview because it was sort of like exciting, because it was like my first interview at like a big company, but it's also kind of traumatizing. So I was like, I didn't know that there were rules or expectations. I just showed up, but I eventually obviously got the job. And it was surprising to me. Like, this, not everybody knows this. The agency we worked for had two different companies that were essentially the same company, but with two different names, and they would compete against themselves, I assume, to sort of like drive internal competition, drive the market, get more coverage, etc. So I actually interviewed at a company called Workbridge, and then got offered a job at a company called JobSpring, which was very confusing until I obviously learned the interconnectedness of them. I believe they were like a half a block from each other. They were in different offices, different kind of brands. And I remember the offices had also very different feels. The JobSpring had the nice office. We had the good one. We had the balcony and everything. And I remember showing up my first day. I worked under someone I still would consider sort of like one of my origin stories within recruiting as a whole, who also happened to be your boss at JobSpring. That was Devin. Devin was actually the person I was supposed to work for. Devin when I joined JobSpring originally, and that's why I was super excited, because I ended up meeting Devin and she talked about working in design, talked about all these things. I was like, oh, I have a degree in this. I was super excited, and then I showed up on day one and ended up working for still someone who's very important to my career, named Mike Sarcosta, working in essentially the opposite of design and product management, which was .NET and QA. And no offense to any of my .NET and QA people out there, but it was not the most exciting field to work in. We're talking about technologies that even when I was recruiting for them were fairly outdated. And QA, which is for better or for worse, often like the lower end of the totem pole in most tech companies. Like a lot of junior level people get their first jobs in QA. And so it was a bit of a shock, because I wasn't working for what I expected. I ended up getting hired by a different company that I wasn't even interviewing for, and had to learn a bunch of things. And that's sort of when I got into this agency space, and it was a lot. I mean, you probably know this. I mean, the expectation at the time, and I know that agencies have evolved a lot in terms of like how they work and how they operate, but when we were doing it, when we were coming up, I feel like we joined that agency space at an interesting sort of cusp period before the more modern approach we see nowadays, and the old school approach that was sort of like built up and sort of I'm losing the word, but like there was a lot of prestige and just like the ability to pick up a phone and make a call happen. And I've always been a very talkative guy, but I'm also a pretty massive introvert. And so the concept of cold calling people, when I found out, I didn't know that the job was cold calling people until like I started doing it. And I remember that being a harrowing experience for me, having to cold call people. And I know there were a lot of people in JobSpring who were just so naturally gifted at it. I know you were one of those people who were just like a savant at least to me. To me, you were a savant on the phone. I just remember you were there a few months prior to me joining, and there was an interesting structure there where to get a promotion to sort of like accelerate your career there, you had to hit a certain number of deals. And I remember it took me 6 months to hit my first deal, which was a long time. It was a long time in that space to get your first deal. Like usually it's your first 2 or 3, you'll luck out, your manager will pass you something. And I can't remember specifically why, but it took me forever. But then once I hit them, I started cascading, and I ended up getting to 10 before I left. So I got halfway to where I needed to be. But I think overall, the agency experience was one where I learned a lot about partially what recruiting was. That job taught me, you're good at recruiting, you're not good at business development, right? And that was sort of the big lesson that I left JobSpring with. And I'm forever grateful for that experience, because it taught me a really valuable lesson, which is like, hey, sometimes you should just do stuff that you aren't good at to like definitively know that you are not good at this, right? And then, I made my way I started the actual, I would say the real sort of straightforward path into like where I am today, sort of like leaving the agency world. But I always look fondly over like the time that I had there, which was, getting calls, getting deals, getting companies to like let me, who had 3 months of experience, hire their like 10 years of experience engineers when like I had no idea what any of the words I was saying were, and moved into a space where I actually got to start getting a little bit more intimate with the candidates, which was the side of the things that I was always much better at, which was good at building relationships, not good at building business relationships.
Mitch, I mean, that was one of the most entertaining and insightful and just personal experiences of someone coming out of the agency world I've heard in a long time. And because you and I go way back, and I actually sat next to you, or you actually sat next to me, or behind me,
like behind me,
you sat behind me, or
We're
vice versa.
back, yeah.
Like I'm just sitting here almost holding back tears, especially those who are listening can't see the visual, because like, man, every single word that you said is true. If it makes you feel any better, cold calling was brutal for me too. It was brutal.
I imagine. I know it was. You just seemed so much better at it than I was.
I just told myself, just put your head down and just make the effort and just put in the reps. So like how I like to share my story is basically I hated cold calling. I hated it just as much as you. But I told myself, if I could just cold call as much and as fast as I could, then hopefully my chance of picking up clients would just like happen so much faster. I can get that over and done with, and then I can just focus on the candidate side, right? But I've never met someone who just absolutely loved cold calling. I mean, maybe one of these days will happen.
I don't know. I mean, the gentlemen, like the 2 guys on my team, my 2 leads, Graydon and Mike, they were gods of cold calling. I don't want to offend anybody, but they were great at it. Like they were exceptionally great at it. And I learned, like now I know they just had done it so long that it was second nature, and they probably had a lot of past relationships they could leverage, but it just set such a, sorry, just kicked my desk. it set such a high expectation of like what was expected, right? Because every call that they would do was be so smooth, and I didn't know what to say. I've learned now that I'm not so good with scripts. I often go off them, and I would get my team upset because I wasn't saying what they were telling me to say, and all these different things. And it was, like I said, it's a valuable experience to me, because now I know, like, this is not what I want to do. And it's a lesson that I try to tell everybody, like, stop focusing on what you should do. Just do a bunch of stuff and figure out what you don't. It's a hell of a lot easier, right?
I completely
that's been my career philosophy. No.
I think that's I vibe with that, not just in career, but just in life, right? You just like just do as many life experiences as you can, and you'll quickly learn more about yourself, what you like, what you don't like. And it's the same thing that can be applied in the career. And that's exactly what you did here. The part about you like having to buy a sports jacket, that also made me chuckle, Mitch, because like I didn't have too many other jobs aside from this one. So like I didn't know what to do or wear or how to dress for this interview too. Unlike you, I walked in. I mean, if I had a tuxedo hanging in my bedroom, I probably would have put that on. But I walked in with a full suit and tie, dress shoes, and the whole shebang. I walked in like, I am grossly overdressed for this interview. But in retrospect, it was probably better than just walking in with like, a t-shirt and flip-flops and doing the other.
I'm glad I didn't do that, because I was already mortified when I was told I needed to shave. Because I didn't think I owned a razor at the time. I was a baby face. So yeah, I think that's it was an interesting experience, right? Like, it taught me a lot about what interviewing is actually like at most companies. And I still to this day is something that I lean back on, of like, okay, what kind of interviewing experience do you not want people to have? Because I like the people at JobSpring and they've done a lot for me, but that interviewing experience was not the best in my experience. It was a little harrowing. A lot of rules and expectations that no one told you.
A lot. And it sounded like you were honestly just thrown in the deep end. So I guess one more thing about the agency world. So for people, again, who are unfamiliar, can you just maybe share a little bit about like, what did your day-to-day actually look like? You mentioned cold calling. And again, before you answer, I do want to add, for this podcast purposes, the agency that we did join, each and every one of us were responsible for our own desk, 360. Basically, biz dev, developing relationships with companies and clients, and then on the other end, candidates. A lot of agencies actually split the two in two different teams, but a lot of agencies also combine them, and that's what we call full desk or 360. So just kind of want to give you a little context, and just, again, would love to kind of hear your experience.
Yeah, for sure.
And what did you like and what did you not like about it?
Yeah. So my day-to-day, it was very structured, as I'm sure you know. It was a very structured approach to how your day was supposed to work, right? In joining an agency, at least the agency we had, I think one of the benefits that I think we're still reaping later in our careers now is JobSpring was really good at making good recruiters. There's some of the best recruiters I know who are no longer at JobSpring, have moved on to other spaces and other sort of pastures, are still some of the best recruiters that I know, and sort of like moved to that space. And they do a really good job of training that and sort of like building that kind of structure. And like I said, I'm forever grateful to that. And like you said, there are things that I liked and there are things that I didn't like, but the general day-to-day, I remember the day started, I think it was 8:00. It was like 8:00, and I think Tuesdays and Thursdays we can get it at 8:30. The day usually started with a stand-up meeting, which now I know what a stand-up meeting is. I know that what we were doing was essentially sort of a spin-off of what is sort of called a scrum or a stand-up meeting in the tech space. And we'd start off that day just sort of going through our desks, right? We had to spend about 10 minutes coming in, usually around like 5-10 minutes coming in, just like literally writing on a piece of paper about like what was on our desk, how many calls did we make yesterday, how many sort of deals did we have. I'm forgetting all of the acronyms we had. We had like a million acronyms that we sort of operated on. And we sort of had to like go through like, okay, how many first round phone calls did you have? How many sort of candidates did you bring in, et cetera? And often, because of my specific scenario where I was really struggling with clients, I didn't spend a lot of time actually like sourcing for candidates. I actually spent the vast majority of my time trying to get clients. And so most of my day, the vast majority of it was going through LinkedIn, looking at jobs that were available, looking at that company, trying to find someone on LinkedIn at that company that had a seemingly relevant title, position, something along those lines, and then going into a tool like ZoomInfo or some sort of contact database and try and find some way to contact them. Normally the expectation was a phone number. And I remember, and this is I don't know. More agency people I've talked to did this same thing, but no one ever really spoke about it. There's a lot of directories we had to call. And so I spent a lot of time just sort of circling my way through a directory, just sort of wasting time, not actually speaking to anybody because I was so nervous about what I had to say and if I was going to say it right. But it was a lot of calling directories and just literally just trying extension numbers, trying to get someone on the line. Even if you're speaking to the wrong person, try to get them to get you to the right person, right? Trying to take on different accents, talking to the receptionist to see if maybe this time this accent will get you to the person that you want to speak to. And basically trying to get those business calls in. And then when I started generating business, I was able to start transitioning into actually like looking for candidates, right? Because like I couldn't look for candidates if I couldn't have business. And, you know, we're talking 360 here. It's my responsibility to both find the jobs and fill them, right? And so when I started getting some clients and getting some interest, I had some job orders sort of on the board, I believe was what they were called. I started like going into the Indeeds of the world, the Monsters of the world, trying to find resumes. And I believe on our desk, we only had one LinkedIn recruiter seat, and that was actually owned by our leads. So I didn't even get to touch LinkedIn Recruiter until I left the agency world, right? I was doing basic LinkedIn searches. I was looking on Indeed for like public resumes, Monster for public resumes, just cold calling people, not even cold calling candidate or companies. I'm cold calling candidates to be like, hey, can you talk? I want to talk to you about a job, and sort of building up that sort of side of things. And once I eventually got to talk to candidates, that's when I started realizing sort of I got to greener pastures in this space, right? Because those first 5 or 6 months when I was really just focused on business development, I was not happy. I did not like it. It was an extremely stressful experience. And because it was taking me so long to get my first deal or to get my first client, I was even more harrowed because there were people who started on the same day as me who were 2 or 3 or 4 deals deep by the time I got my first real like job order and things like that. And so once I started being able to talk to candidates, once I started having a couple of like potential deals on my desk, I was able to start seeing the side of recruiting that I felt like I was actually good at, which was building good relationships. And a lot of my initial deals with candidates were a lot of my initial deals in the agency space were actually because I just knew the candidates really well. And I was able to find jobs that candidate was good for, as opposed to the other way around, which is find a job and then just find a candidate that's good for it, right? My very first deal was a gentleman named Robert Pike, and I still talk to him to this day. He was a .NET developer. I learned a lot about him, and I was able to find him a very small startup that needed his very niche experience in like desktop development in the Microsoft environment, right? And so that's sort of what, you know, the good and bad sides of the agency side, right? Is I got to talk to a lot of people. I got to meet a lot of candidates. I got to learn a lot about business and sort of like all these different things and sort of like starting to understand navigating organizational structures and stuff like that. But there was the other side, which was the rise and grind, which I very quickly learned is not my cup of tea. I am a work to live kind of a guy. I'm not a live to work kind of a guy. And so it's lessons learned on both sides, right? It's what am I good at versus what do I never really want to do again? So
I love it. I love it. So typically in our industry, a lot of people, even to this day, who start recruiting, start like us. Majority of entry level roles out there are typically through agencies. I know you'll find a handful of coordinator roles or entry level roles in tech, but obviously it's a lot fewer out there in terms of the options and opportunities. So you got in, you literally were thrown in the deep end, you had to figure this whole 360 situation out, brand new industry. And then you kind of mentioned that, you know, you got into a good rhythm, got into a good cadence, you did about 10 placements. And then around that time, you're like, you know what, maybe I should think about doing something else. So what kind of sparked you to leave? Was it really your just complete hatred towards business development? You're like, I never want to do it ever again. Or, you know, at that time, you're like, you know what, I do like certain aspects of recruiting, and this is something that I can really just embrace and see myself doing this aspect of recruiting for the rest of my career. And so what was kind of your thought process, and why did you end up going to in-house?
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me, right? Because I feel like around the time that I ended up leaving the agency space, it was also around the time where I really started to like find my place in New York, right? Like, because you have to keep in mind that when I started doing this job, I had only ever lived in like the biggest city I'd ever lived in had like a population of like 200,000, right? Like, and I grew up in the backwoods, like literally the backwoods. I had farms on 3 sides of my house, right? And so New York was a crazy experience for me, both as a sort of a working opportunity, working at JobStream, but also just like trying to find myself. And I think around the time where I started having thoughts of like, I should maybe look to do something else, was around the time where I started actually feeling comfortable in New York, right? Like JobStream was kind of a safety net. I have a lot of friends there. There was a lot of social activities around JobSpring, and it was like felt very good. And I feel like around the time where I I started looking for a job was around the time when I realized like, hey, I don't actually hang out with the JobSpring folks as much as I used to, right? I started having my own friend groups and things like that. And so I think a lot of it, if I had that earlier, there's probably a good chance I would have left earlier. But a lot of it was the closest thing to a home that I had at the time. It was the closest thing to a safety net that I had. And it's not like I was there for the money. Agency recruiting, especially entry level, is not the most lucrative field. It becomes a much more sort of lucrative sort of opportunity down the line, but getting started, it wasn't. And so, the main callus was there is that I started to find my mojo, if you will, within sort of the New York space. And the other side of it was I was very into a gaming community at the time. I did a lot of setting up gaming meetups, LAN parties, those kinds of things. And I remember VR at the time was sort of like up and coming. And I had taken a couple of phone calls. I remember I talked to like people at Jet and a couple of other places back in the day, even like early Riot. I was just not experienced enough to really make it at a company like that. And I found this opportunity at a very small team. They were 10 people and they just needed somebody that knew just a little bit more about hiring than they could. And I just sort of jumped on it. Right. It was a big pay increase for me. And I remember what sealed my overall impression of JobSpring was when I accepted the offer and I went in and I remember I was terrified. I was so terrified to tell my team. I was so terrified to tell Sloan, the gentleman who ran our office and the New York City division, that I was leaving, because they were, like I said, they were the closest thing to a family that I had in New York at the time. And I remember telling everybody what I was going to do. It was like, I'm going to go lead recruiting. I'm going to go be the recruiter for this very small VR startup. And everyone was just so happy for me. And it was a weird experience because I was expecting everybody to be upset or sort of judgmental or any of these things, all the thoughts you have when you're be quitting, you're leaving your first job. It's super natural. But when I met them and I told them like, I'm going to go work in VR, that makes so much sense. We're so happy for you. Like, I'm sad to see you go, but like, this makes so much sense. And that gesture was sort of like what really solidified the thinking I now have, which is like what JobSpring did for me at that point in my career and sort of helped me understand a lot about why I made the decision I did and when I made it. So it really didn't have too much to do with any sort of like specific feelings, because I think by the time I was about a year and a half in, I was kind of numb to a lot of the feelings I had the first 6 months in. I had finally found my groove, but a lot of it had to do with how long it actually took me to do it. And by then it was really just like, I wanted to do something that I was better at. And I wanted to do something that was more in line with the things that I liked doing, which is the people aspects and the candidate connections and those things, and not so much the sales. I respect the hell out of people who can do that because I can't still to this day. So yeah.
So what was your day-to-day like at in-house, and what was, I guess, the biggest difference aside from the sales aspect working at like a startup in-house versus obviously an agency like JobSpring?
I mean, the biggest transition point for me, and I maybe have a bit of a different experience, but I think everyone's experience is a little bit different. I left a very structured environment where there were very clear expectations. There were very clear numbers and deliverables and things you had to hit. And I joined a team where I was the only recruiter. My CEO was younger than me. The founders were the other founder was the same age as me. Right. And it was an interesting experience because I had to take a lot of what I learned from JobSpring and bring it into an agency world where we both know it's not a one-to-one translation, right? It's a very different in-game. There's a very different process of how things go. But I took a lot of what I learned from guiding my candidates through other people's interview processes, through other people's sort of approaches. And I took a lot of the things that I learned from the agency space in sort of having this outside-in view of other companies. And I sort of like patchworked together things that I liked to start building out a process, right? And I think the day-to-day there was different every single day. And I think that was the hardest part, was that at JobSpring or at the agency, everything was the same. Pretty much every day, every Monday was going to be the same as last Monday. Tuesday is going to be the same as last Tuesday. Friday is going to be the same as last Friday. We're going to do everything we can to get a half day, that kind of stuff, right? And I came in the agency side, especially for, we were pre-Series A. We were like in between seed and Series A when I joined this company. Every day was different. And not every day was just recruiting. Some days we're trying to source an ATS system because our applicant tracking system at the time was our CEO's email and like kind of Indeed and like kind of Monster, and sort of like having to find that. And then also like having to work with our CEO on like a pitch deck because he needed certain different sort of opinions on these spaces, having to learn about payroll because I was the closest thing that our team had to an HR person at the time. We did have an HR person, but they were in India. And like, I think that is where I started to become who I am today. And it's sort of where where a lot of seeds were planted, sort of for a lot of things that I'm starting to realize are blossoming from the things that I learned back then. And I think it's hard to talk about what the day-to-day was because the day-to-day was so different. And I did that for 2 years and it got better and it got more structured. And I ended up hiring a recruiter to work for me. I became the manager there, which is crazy because I had 2 years of experience, and I the biggest transition was I did a lot more of what I wanted to do, but I also got to do a lot of things that I didn't realize I wanted to do. It's where I started opening doors of like, I like process. I like the creative aspect. I got started to like be able to tap into the things that I sort of walked away from when I decided I didn't want to pursue anything in the degree that I sort of went to school for. And so I can't give you a straight answer because every day was a little bit different. I can give you a straight answer about like what my day looks like now because it's a lot more structured. But then I think it was the juxtaposition. It was the chaos from the structure that sort of built a foundation for me. Like, so those two experiences hand in hand are a lot of what sort of created the person I am today. So I hope that's a good enough
I'm
answer.
assuming, no, it's fantastic. And I'm assuming at this first company, did you also receive equity as well?
Yeah, I did.
How did you, and this was the first time that you've ever received equity at a job, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So for someone that obviously worked at a recruiting agency that was very much focused in the technology space, where we guided and help guide and navigate equity and compensation for others, this time you actually left the agency world to join a startup where you got, I'm assuming, a compensation package that consisted of a salary and equity. So how did that feel? Was it like super exciting? Like, oh my God, like I've been talking to professionals like for a year and a half at the agency talking about equity. Now I actually have some of my own. Like, how did that feel? Or were you like, oh my God?
Yeah. I mean, it was a sense of investment. Yeah. And I mean, I think the longer you stay in the startup industry, the more you get a bit more jaded about equity, right? Like I've been in the startup industry or the startup side of tech for, like I said, close to 10 years now. And I haven't seen my equity do very much yet. And I still own some equity from companies I've worked at. I'm still waiting on something to happen. I know a lot of people who have had their equity do things, work for some successful companies through the end. But I remember back in the day, I was very invested, right? Because I got a lot of equity. I was pre-seed. Like my equity, I believe my strike price at the time was something like 3 cents. It was like extremely low because I joined so early. And so like the company at the time had this great vision and they had all these fun things. And I remember it was really important to me then because it gave me a sense of like, this work that I'm doing is not just to get my paycheck and not get fired and sort of do these different things. Cause like, let's keep in mind, like I still had no idea what I wanted to do. Even at the time, I didn't even know if I still wanted to be a recruiter. I was just doing a lot of things, but having that equity piece for me early on made me a lot more invested in the future of like where this company was going and a lot of the actions that went beyond just like making it through the day. Because I knew that like, if I did things to help increase the quality of the work, there was hypothetically a sort of payoff for me down the line, right? Like now I know there's a little bit more nuance going into it and it's maybe not as heavy as it is in reality. But for me back then, equity was actually very important. It was like legitimately a sense of ownership. So it was an interesting experience for sure. I have different views on it now though.
It's kind of funny and sad that you said that the longer you stay in tech, the more jaded you become. It's actually kind of true. I mean, you talk to folks that have just been around the block and they're like, I don't care about equity. I just want straight up cash now. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I understand that. I used to think that was crazy that people would say that. Right. It's like, what do you mean? You get a slice of like the company's future. And like my stance on it now is not that I don't want equity. Of course I want equity. I want investment in the company. I want investment in the future of this, like the success of this company. But I also have to pay bills. Like I refuse to work for a company that's going to pay 20K below market because they really believe in their equity. Like, I don't care what you believe in. I know how much money I need to pay my bills. And so like equity, I've sort of changed that opinion into like, equity is the icing on the cake, but it should not be the cake. You shouldn't take a slice out of the cake because there's equity there. It's just the nice icing on top, right? And like I said, I'm extremely jaded now. I've had more equity packages than most have, and I've had those equity packages turned to nothing multiple times at this point. So, but at the time, like I said, not to degrade any of it, it was very important to me back then.
So from the first company till now, you've worked at a handful of other great tech companies in different sectors and space. So as someone who works on the internal TA team or the recruiting team, aside from like, your core, just your core scope of reaching out to candidates, and then obviously like building the pipeline, the whole interview process, what are the different variables that change in terms of like, just your kind of your day-to-day, your experience at different companies in a TA role? So whether it's like maybe your relationships with the founder or the hiring managers, or maybe like the size of the team. So from your experience, like what was that?
Are we talking about like the biggest variables that like affect my job as a recruiter?
As what you did every single day? Like what overall kind of remained the same? in terms of like, you know, day to
I get what
day
you're
at
saying,
different
yeah.
companies, but what were the things that kind of changed?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the bigger experiences I had, right, was joining a company called N26, right? It was my first like real recruiting job. And I feel like, not to degrade the experience I had at JobSpring or the experience I had at LiveLike, sort of joining that very early team. Those were my foundational experiences, and they kind of led up to me having this job at N26, which was like my first experience working for like a real recruiting team. And it was an interesting sort of like juxtaposition, but of still getting to work in this scrappy sort of soloist capacity, like I've had most of my career, but also still getting to work for a very structured organization that had good and bad rules that I sort of had to navigate around. And I think the variables that a lot of what stayed the same is the core principle of the job. Everyone just wants the best talent, right? And everyone wants a million software engineers. They want a very talented, very charismatic product manager, right? Like, and I think one of the things I've learned in working for more than a few companies now is like every company feels like their needs are incredibly unique. And the reality of the situation is most companies are looking for pretty much the same thing. There's maybe one or two roles at every company that I've worked for that are really specific and unique, but then all the rest of them are pretty straightforward. And one of the things I've learned is to try and help people understand that sometimes they're building mountains out of molehills. And I think that is something that I have to do a lot in terms of like, you're setting a bar incredibly high for a role that doesn't need it to be that high, right? You're looking for someone who can just do the thing. And sometimes it's okay to just hire people who can do the thing. There's no shame in that. You know, everybody has to just do the thing before they can become the person who is the thing, right? And that's sort of something that I've seen a lot in a lot of internal roles is there's a lot of consistency in terms of what people are looking for. And I think the other thing is a lot of culture, which I think is an important thing for internal recruiters, right? And I think it's something that doesn't get talked about nearly as much as I wish it did in the internal recruiting space, which is like my job, yes, is to find the person, but my job is also, I am the first impression for any person who's going to potentially join this company of what culture is here. And it's something that I've always, once I realized that, sort of the realization that I've had with that, I started taking that job very seriously. And I started looking and like, okay, what is culture? What are these things? And I've realized that like culture is one of the few things that actually does trickle down. Let me put it that way, which is the mindset that your founders and your leaders have, regardless of the value set you have, regardless of the mentality that I have, the team that I have has, or the relationships I have with my peers at a company. If your leadership team, your founders, the expectation that's coming down from the decisions that are being made above, if those aren't in line with the type of relationships and the type of values that you have between you and your colleagues, you're likely going to become more of them versus them becoming more of you, right? And that's something that's always been the same in startups as well. It's like a lesson that I've had to learn over time. And so the day-to-day had a lot to do with what most people probably expect. It's just reaching out to candidates, making these sort of like outreaches, finding the right person on LinkedIn. And we can get in, I can talk about Boolean for hours if you want to, but it's just about making those connections and finding the right person. And I think over time, the thing that has changed the most is like my understanding of what makes the right person, right? Like when I was in the LiveLike, my very first sort of startup days, it was a lot about the buzzwords. It was a lot about checking the boxes. It was a lot about finding the sort of the purple unicorn, or, you know, finding the profile that has the words that you need them to have so you can justify reaching out and justify having a call. And now I realize that it's a lot more about the person on the other end of the phone than it is about the skills that they have. And it's about trying to, one, help that person understand that, hey, you are the person for this job. Like, I know it, but also helping my peers and my sort of internal stakeholders understand that like this person is more than just a collection of their skills. They're going to bring a lot more to this job than, you know, maybe they have 80% of what you want, but they have 110% of what this company needs, right? And so those are sort of the things that have sort of changed, and sort of like some stayed the same, some have changed. Most of it has been me and my understanding of the job, but internal recruiting is basically the same at every company, right? It is find the person, get them on the phone, get them in front of the hiring manager, get them through the process, close them. It's pretty straightforward.
I did love how you said that how someone can get a first taste of the culture of a company is how they interact, or how their experience is summed up with the initial recruiter, right? Because like it is absolutely trickle down effect. Like how you are behaving and thinking, what you're saying is definitely a result of like the founders and the leadership that are at that company. And recruiters are essentially the gatekeepers as well, right? Your first experience is critical. And I think this is definitely something I just want to emphasize again, because it's 100% true. I know candidates that deliberately shut down interview processes because their interview process or experience was just horrible, even though it was with another company that may have had a bigger brand recognition or more.
The best offer they've ever gotten, the coolest company in the world, but then the people sucked. Yeah, I see that all the time. I've had people walk away from my companies because of that, right? And I had to learn a lot of lessons about like, okay, it doesn't matter if I'm a good first round call. If everybody else behind me doesn't care, like it doesn't matter how hard I work. right?
Now, for someone who's worked at a good number of like different tech companies, did you find that you got better responses or higher just response rate or engagements with your outreach dependent on specific companies that you work for? So in other words, did you have, if you were to reach out to the
Yeah, I
same
get what you're
person,
asking, yeah.
right? If you reach out to the same person and you're working at company A, maybe this candidate would have ignored you, but then you move to company B, you reach out to the same person, they actually respond to you because maybe like it's a mission that it's something that this candidate can vibe into, or they're just more excited, it's more sexy. Have you seen a lot of that?
I have absolutely seen a lot of that. The biggest lesson I learned early in my career is exactly what we're talking about. Is it doesn't matter how on point your message is, how informative it is, how creative it is, how engaging it is. If someone doesn't care about what you're trying to sell, they're not going to respond. It doesn't matter like how quirky your subject line is or any of these different things. Like I worked for a VR company that used game technology to build sports experiences, right? So I was trying to hire big video game creation people, like nerds, like people like me in my sort of free time, like people who make video games, to build a sports product, like a sports viewing product, right? And there's a very specific cross section of people who really like video games and really like live sports. And it's very hard to find that, right? And so I was reaching out to a lot of people who were just wanting to build video games. They were trying to use Unity and they're trying to build indie games or work on AAA titles. And I'm like, hey, you want to help me build a live sports viewing experience using everything you have, right? And so there's a lot of amazing people I reached out to who just, they didn't care. And then that's fine. But, you know, when I spent a year during the pandemic working in crypto at 2 separate companies, I've never had the response rates I've ever had when I was reaching out for people, like just being part of a cryptocurrency company, just because we're talking like, I think the wool has started to get pulled off people's eyes nowadays, but like we're talking last year when we're like NFT heyday and like all these crypto things and the surge of Bitcoin and all this stuff. And I'm reaching out to people and like, I'm getting crazy response rates. We're talking like 30-40% response rates on like multiple 100-person campaigns that I'm like reaching out to. And like I think I'm a good messenger. I think I have good sort of like outreach campaigns and things like that. It's one of the things I pride myself on. But I also know for a fact that had a lot to do with the fact of like the company I worked at and the time that existed, right? And I worked at a more middle of the road company in 26, which was a banking company. And that company had a lot more to do with what I was saying because I was looking to hire people in New York, and every other company in New York's a fintech company. So it didn't necessarily matter too much what I was reaching out about. It mattered a lot more about what I was saying and what I was offering in that capacity, right? So it kind of shifts. It depends on where you work at. Sometimes who they are and what they stand for really matters. Sometimes it really doesn't, and it matters what you're saying and how you're saying it and how you're approaching it. And I think that's kind of the situation I'm in now. I work for a very specific type of tech company, and most people would be interested in it if they find out what it is, but I have to be compelling enough for people to want to be curious about finding out what it is, right? So it varies, and you just have to really think critically about the type of company that you're working at, and if you can leverage that or not. And if you can, you should, but you can't always.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think that you yourself does this, or maybe you might know if other recruiters do this, that when the time comes that they find another job, right? They want another recruiting job, that one of the criteria is like, how easy do you think you can succeed in that job? You know, in terms of like how easy you think you can recruit for that job based on what the company does.
I don't think about that, but I would not blame anybody for having that be one of their criterias, right? Like I could absolutely understand that. And I think I'm kind of jaded because I've always been in roles where I've been on the back foot. Like I've been in very like, people didn't know about the companies. I had to help build employer brand and all these things. And I enjoy that challenge. So I don't think too much about like how hard is it going to be to find the roles that they look for? Because if I thought about that, I wouldn't have joined the company I'm at now, because it's very hard to find what we're looking for. But I think it is something that people should consider, right? And I think people need to decide for themselves, how hard do you want your job to be? And which parts of your job do you want to be hard? Because if you want an easy job, no offense to my FANG people out there, go work at a FANG company. If you want to have an easy recruiting job, go work at a FANG company. You've got notoriety, you've got internal databases, you've got every knob and lever you can pull to be successful, and a lot of things are set up on rails, right? And it's just a matter of input, right? And that's fine. And I do not judge or chastise people for that, but I know I couldn't do that, right? I like to build my own knobs and rails and all these different things. And you have to really think about what aspects of your job you want to be difficult, right? For me, I like the challenge of difficult roles. I like the challenge of a very niche specific skill set I need to find. I like the thought of there's only 50 people in the world that do this job and I need to get one of them to accept this job, right? Like that's a fun, compelling challenge for me. What I don't like is office politics and overstructure and having to be that person's version of what a good recruiter looks like, right? I am my version of what a good recruiter looks like. And I work for a team that understands that I don't recruit the way that they recruit. And I don't expect them to recruit the way that I recruit, right? And I'm going to work the advantages that I have. And I want that part of my job to be easy. I want the sort of the challenging aspects to be what we're looking for. And that hunt, that aspect of that, that's fun. Closing people, getting people excited, getting people invested in our company. Those are the challenges I want. So I think people just have to decide like which aspects of their job they want to be difficult, because every company is going to provide different things. And there's no shame in one over the other. It's just a matter of you and what you need, you know?
Absolutely. I also vibe with the whole like the hunt experience, and being able to kind of come up and utilize and optimize your own tools to kind of get the job done. I do want to ask you, like, you have a great background because you do have experience working at not just one or two, but a good sample of great tech companies in different industries. So just talking to you just makes me personally curious about a couple of things as well. So one of the things, let's just talk about comp and just how startups give or tech companies offer comp. And the smaller the company goes, it's very known in the industry that, they do their best with salary, but we all know it's below market. And they try to fill in that gap with equity. But of course,
they try to pretend like it's not. Yeah,
exactly. But after 2022, we are seeing a lot more effort of small companies really stretching to be as competitive as possible because the war for talent's insane. So out of all the different companies that you've worked in, how do the companies just differ? Were a lot of them just like the top 10% in terms of salary and comp that came out, were most maybe bottom 40%? A lot of them were in the average, in the middle. What were just kind of the broad stroke kind of ethos, if you will, behind equity and salary, and what worked and what didn't work?
For sure.
Kind of just hear your experience there.
So comp has always been an interesting experience for me. This job that I'm in now is probably, I don't want to say the first time, but probably the last like 2 years has been the first time that I even personally feel like I've been paid fairly. Now, at the time when I was working at other companies, I didn't realize I wasn't being paid fairly because, we started on the back foot starting in the agency world. Like I said, we started at the very low, very bottom of the totem pole, essentially minimum wage. And so my expectations and sort of perspective was skewed a lot, right? And a lot of how I viewed comp skewed the way that I talked about comp in the earlier days of my career, right? When I worked at a Series A company or like a series, like pre-seed, Series A, Series B company, we vastly underpaid, right? It was vastly underpaid. And we also like vastly oversold the value of our equity, right? A lot, because I had to, right? I had to sort of sell snake oil, essentially, right? And it is an aspect of my career that I don't like that I had to do. And it has influenced a lot of how I approach these things nowadays, because I look back on it, I'm like, I was just lying. I knew this wasn't the case. I knew this wasn't it. I just knew this wasn't fair, right? I knew that I was hiring this person straight out of college and I was paying them $20K less than they would get at any other company, regardless if they were big or small, right?
But sorry to interrupt you, Mitch. But on that point, that worked though, right? Like
it did.
It worked. And many companies in that day and today still do that. And that still works.
It still does work. Yeah. And I don't like that. I don't like that I was part of that machine, right? But also like I was a victim of that machine at the same time, right? I was Stockholming myself, right? Because I was able to lean on a good culture and I was able to lean on like a compelling product. And there were other aspects. There's always other aspects of a job or of taking an offer besides, how much money you get paid. But I think there's a lot of rhetoric at companies like that do underpay, whether it be 10K or 10% or 5% or, 30%, whatever. There's a lot of rhetoric there that it's not about the money. People shouldn't be caring about the money. If they're just talking about base salary, they don't actually want to work here. And like anytime I get a hiring manager to tell me that, excuse my language, but I tell them like, that's bullshit. You can go fuck yourself. Like that's not true. Like it is about the money. People have to pay their bills. If someone built a quality of life for themselves working for like a prestige tech company, or I don't know, I'm just going to throw out a random number, they were making 170K a year. Like I get that they were being overpaid at that company, but they built their quality of life there and they built their life around those things. And they were there for 3 or 4 years. And for them to make a decision to take an offer at 150K, that's a big life decision. That's 20K. That's 20K less dollars than they had the year before. Right. And so to think that it's not about money is naive. To understand that it is about money and to talk about it and sell it and be honest about it and leverage the fact that it is about money is a completely different thing altogether. And that's sort of the approach that I've taken nowadays, right? Which is be candid. I will tell you what our pay is. I finally work for a company that I feel like actually cares about pay equality. We care about these things. We've had a comp and reward. We were Series B when we were hiring for a comp and rewards person. I didn't have a comp and rewards person at my Series D startup till we were almost 1,500 people, right? I work for a company, 200 people. We have a total reward structure. We have straight up pay bands. We have a structured approach to leveling. We have a structured approach to how we level people, right? And we have pay bands that are transparent to candidates when we're talking to them. When I talk to a candidate, I tell them, this is what our leveling system looks like, and this is how much money you would make here, right? In this band, right? Give or take. And that has helped so much more than trying to skirt around the truth and trying to pretend like we're paying more than we can, right? I think be honest, don't waste anybody's time, because if you say a number and someone doesn't want it, there's nothing you can do to make that person happy with that number. If a person gets excited for that number and they're okay with it, that person's going to work for your company a hell of a lot longer than the person you convinced the number was good. And then they eventually find out that you're paying them 20K less than either the market or anybody else in the team. Right.
What about if you wanted someone super badly and then they were just a little bit too expensive? Would you ever make an exception and kind of stretch the bands, or would it always just have to be on like the shoulders of the candidates saying, "Hey, it is what it is. If
that's
you want to work here."
Yeah, and that's a tricky one. And in the past, I would have said yes. At a company like ours that is structured and has sort of the transparent pay and sort of takes the market research aspects of things like seriously and reevaluates their salaries like every 6 months and readjusts our bands on a very consistent basis, it is what it is at a company like ours, right? We made a promise to everyone here that, when we adjust bands, they're going to affect you. They're not just going to affect the new people coming in. They're going to affect you too, the people who work here. If suddenly, recruiters start making 10% more, I'm going to get a pay bump. Like, that's just how it works, because that's our philosophy here. So here it is what it is. But I've worked for companies before that don't have as much of a structured approach, and I will make those exceptions, right? Because at the end of the day, I have to be a little bit selfish. I have to look out for myself, and I'm going to try and get this person into the door, even knowing that 6 months before I hired someone for 20K less than this person, or this person maybe is less experienced or something like that. But right now we need this person. But I also know that making decisions like that, they aren't isolated. They come back, I can't think of a time that I didn't do something like, or I did something like that and it didn't come back to bite us. Either they left after 3 months, someone found out that they were getting paid like a significantly more than them. That person had significantly higher expectations for what they were going to be able to do with their scope of work, or quite frankly, they ended up being an asshole. Like, they ended up just being a bad person to work with, right? And every time you do that, you have to understand that like you are making a short-term decision that is going to have mid to long-term repercussions, right? And that those decisions tend to snowball, right? Every time you make an exception on a salary, whether it be down or up, above the standard, you're snowballing something internally, and that can turn out 100 different ways, but something will happen eventually, right? And you'll have to pay for it one way or the other.
I completely agree, and I'm really happy you brought that up. I mean, a lot of people think that recruiting is just finding a candidate, placing them, and not caring about what happens afterwards. But if you do it correctly, everyone wants that one person to stay at the company for a long term. And if you do things not in the perfect way, shall we say, or in a manner that's not,
you want to call it the wrong way,
or it's not transparent. A company can just knuckle their way or push or manipulate a candidate to accept an offer. And that might be a short win, like you said. But I mean, is it going to be a long one? Usually not, because that person will either leave or find somewhere else, right, that treats them better. So I think having a long-term perspective is super key. And I love how you also just touched upon bands. And so, but not just bands, but also recalibrating bands constantly depending on market situations. There's so many times for myself in the agency where I talk to companies like, yeah, Preston, like, we're good. Like, we have these bands, and I'm like, these bands make no sense. And they're like, well,
you made them 3 years ago.
I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, what is your source to help you make these bands? And when were these sources last updated? And exactly, like, they're just not reflecting true market conditions, especially now. And so it's really, really cool and refreshing for me to hear that you're working at a company that obviously takes that very seriously and just, prioritizing comp rewards, HR, onboarding, recruiting as its own division with legs that you stand on, rather than being at a company that just looks at anything HR recruiting related as an afterthought, right?
I call it being a service vertical versus being a consultative vertical, right? This is one of the first companies I've worked at that actually truly treats recruiting as a consultative vertical. My job, at the end of the day, the mentality that should be had is, if you're my hiring manager, it's your job to hire this person. It's not my job. It's your job to hire this person. You're the person that gets affected if we don't hire this person. My job is to fill the blanks or fill the voids in your understanding of how do we get that person, right? I'm here to help you build the process, help you build your understanding, help you build your approach, right? To second guess you, to poke holes in your sort of assumptions about, A, B, or C. Right.
Yeah.
That's my job. And you see that a lot in verticals like recruiting. I think of things like technical writing. I think of things like project management, right? IT, right? These are all verticals that, if mistreated, are approached with an afterthought mentality, like you mentioned, they become service verticals. It's someone walks in the door, says, "Hey, I need a butt in this seat," and then they leave. That is sort of a product of that short-term mentality. That person, I'll put the butt in the seat, but I can't guarantee you that butt's going to stay in that seat for more than 3 to 6 months, right? And that always happens. It happens over and over again. And I've worked at plenty of companies that had that sort of mentality, or unintentionally created that reality through the way that they sort of approach these things, right? And you mentioned banding earlier as well. Like, I think this is the first company that I've worked at that actually used market data to structure their bands. Every other company I've worked at before, they would say they were doing research, but I also know that the vast majority of that research was just talking to hiring managers and just aggregating numbers based off like what people in the company thought, right? We pay a company to have access to their market data. It's a company called Radford. They're great. They can give you a leveling system. They can give you market data. You can really understand like where in the percentile you are, like which region of the world do you want to pay off of, right? That is dedication. Talking to your VP of engineering and asking what his opinion on a senior level, what a senior level engineer should make, that's incredibly biased, right? Like that does not create parity. That does not create equality. That does not create a fair environment from a comp perspective, right? You have to be unbiased and you have to follow the data, right? Which is wild to me that tech companies do things like that, when every tech company's like, "We love data." Like, how'd you make your bands? I don't know. Greg said that. Like, so
Mitch is dropping the facts and the bombs. Gasp! The truth is out about the startup world.
It's a very well-known secret.
Couple more questions. I know I want to respect your time. So, for someone who's also just recruited a bunch of positions, like in retrospect and even currently, what would you say are some of your favorite types of roles to recruit?
A product and design. I mean, the types of roles that I work on now, right?
Mitch, that was my market. That was my OG market.
That was the market I was supposed to be. I was supposed to be on your team. But product and design, it's been the space that I've always been able to connect with, right? Because one of my philosophies when I talk to people about their careers and things like that is never discount all of your experience. All of my experience is not all of my experience as a tech recruiter. All of my experience is everything I did in my entire life, right? It's what I did when I was crawling under houses doing pest control. It's what I went to school for, even though I'm not using it, right? Being able to leverage my understanding of design theory and product management and sort of the creative aspects of the things that I learned and sort of bring that into my recruiting world has been this like very serendipitous experience for me, right? I've hired for product managers before. I've hired for designers before. I've hired animators before. I've never got to solely focus on it because if you work at any tech company, regardless of how many designers you have, there's 30 times more engineers that you need to hire for, right? And so I love my engineers. I still keep in touch with a lot of the engineers that I've hired and worked with throughout the years, but product and design is one of the things that feels natural for me. And I think one of the goals I always had, or sort of I've recently realized I've always had, but I've always sort of passively had in the back of my mind, is that when I'm recruiting for a role, I know I'm doing a good job when the engineer I'm talking to on the end of the line says, "What team do you work for? Are you an engineer?" That's when I know I'm doing a good job. And it comes a lot more naturally to me when I talk about things like product management, when I talk about things like design, is I can much more quickly understand and adapt to what our company is looking for because I have a base of empathy for it, right? Engineering, it's a little tricky. I had to learn the buzzwords and then I had to learn what the buzzwords actually mean. And then I could get to that point. For product and design, it becomes a little bit more second nature. So yeah, product and design all the way.
It's really cool. You're doing a full circle from your design-centric degree.
Serendipity.
Back in college. For me, again, no disrespect at all to engineers, but I'd rather look at portfolios all day than GitHubs and
I know plenty of people who work in like engineering recruiting who like could not be bothered to hire product managers because they love my product managers as well. Y'all are difficult to work with. Y'all are very hard to hire. y'all are real good at lying, are just faking it, right? And so like there's give and take, right? Like I could never hire for marketing. It is so ethereal to me. Like I don't know how people do that, right? Like what do you look for? What do you source for, right? So, but yeah, product and design is it's just the thing that makes the most sense for me. And it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just thing I feel like I'm better at, or at least
No,
I want to be.
I have, and I will always have a huge soft spot for product design forever and ever and ever. What are some go-to tools that you like to work in day to day? You just can't live without as a recruiter. Tools,
Oh
plugins.
God, you're asking me a difficult question to give a very simple answer to. I'm a gadgets man. If you haven't been able to pick up on the subtle signs throughout this call, I have ADHD, so I like a lot of things for very short amount of time. So I have a lot of gadgets, I have a lot of tools. Part of my ways that I have worked through my own sort of neurodiversity through the years has been automation and tools and sort of things to sort of lean on internally. Things I can't live without on the tool front side. I mean, spreadsheets. God, if I would have told 20-year-old me that I loved spreadsheets, I think I would have thrown up. But I love spreadsheets because there's just so many things that I didn't realize I could do with them. They bring to like my abilities, whether it be sort of like long-term trackers and sort of supplementing inadequate tools. I won't name any ATSs in this call, but there's one particular ATS that is very arboreal in nature, that is very bad at what it does. And so I have to supplement that a lot with spreadsheets. And so anything Google Sheets related, can't be bothered to download any Microsoft tools. So Google Sheets, I use a process management, or it's my own little personal project management tool that combines to-do lists and calendars. It's a tool called Akiflow or Akiflow. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but it's amazing. It helps me combine both my schedule and my to-do list sort of like seamlessly. It has some very nice shortcuts, and also a really powerful automation tool internally that I use both for sourcing, managing my day, all these things. It's called Alfred. It supplements Spotlight on your Mac if you have it. But there isn't really anything in the recruiting space that I would say like I can't live without. Like I would live without this very arboreal ATS if I could, but I feel like recruiting is one of the spaces that really needs a lot of disruption. There's not a lot of tools in the space that do what they should. If I could burn LinkedIn Recruiter, I would. If I burn it to the ground, I would burn it to the ground. There's so many things that tool needs to do that it doesn't do. But that's a talk for a different day. So those are the three I would say.
We can have a whole other podcast on LinkedIn Recruiter.
Like what could LinkedIn Recruiter do better from a recruiter?
So what's new for you, Mitch, after I mean, you're obviously working in a fantastic company. It sounds like from a recruiting point of view, it sounds almost like the dream. It's a company that truly respects recruiting for what it should be, and it trickles down into obviously everything from bands to how you're selling and reaching out to candidates there. But do you see yourself staying there, knock on wood, for a long term? Like, where do you see yourself in the future in the next 3 to 5 years? Do you see yourself maybe getting out of recruiting, or are you recruiting for life till you retire?
I don't know. See, that's a question I don't know how to answer. It's a question I find myself asking myself. It's like, am I going to be a recruiter 3 years from now? Like, I don't know. I kind of just go with the flow. And I think I'm not opposed to one day doing something else, but I feel like I'm finally at a point in my career where I feel genuinely good at what I do. Right. I think the pandemic really threw me for a loop for a bit. And there were some periods in there where I genuinely wasn't good at what I did. And it was my fault. It's not because I was bad. It's because I was utilizing myself poorly. And, it's hard for me to say if I am, 10 years from now, when I have kids and they're off in college, am I going to be a recruiter? I don't know. Am I going to be some sort of C-level executive? Like maybe, I don't know. Or am I going to just like run a bar? Like any of these things could be possible. But yes, as far as Chronospheres goes, I mean, and I tell this to candidates, this is part of one of the pitches when people ask me about culture at Chronosphere. My honest answer is this is the first company I've worked at probably since I started working in tech as a recruiter that a year in, I haven't had the thought of like, I wonder how much longer I'm going to be here, right? I kind of put myself on a soft timeline. Every company I've been at, probably about like 6 months to a year in, I put myself on a time like, I'll start looking for a job like 6 months from now or a year from now. This is the first job where my thought right now is I will stay as long as they let me stay. Right? Like I will be here in 5 years if you let me be here in 5 years, right? And even regardless of what my position is. But I think I've also accepted that I just want to be a recruiter right now. I just want to do my job and I want to be good at it. I'm not trying to be a leader. I'm not trying to manage people. I'm just trying to be good at this thing. And ask me this question again in a year and you might get a different answer. But for now, I want to stay here as long as they'll let me stay here, and I want to get real good at what I do.
I love it. Now for a couple more questions. So for someone that wants to hopefully work at a Chronosphere-like company, right? Yeah. Maybe they're at a company right now and they're just not happy. Or maybe they're looking to kind of start their in-house recruiting career at a tech company. If you were them and you were to kind of go back in time, like what sort of maybe questions or things would you really look out for when it comes to interviewing and selecting companies that you want to interview for to kind of maximize the chance of finding a company like Chronosphere?
So a company like Chronosphere exists not because of what we do or what we built or the success we have in sales or how much we pay or anything like that. All of those things exist because of the mentality of the people who both started the company, run the company, and sustain the company, right? Has nothing to do with our industry. It has nothing to do with our business, right? There could be a company just like Chronosphere in, I don't know, the CMS space for marketing, right? Like that could absolutely exist, right? And what I always tell people is don't get too focused on what a company does. You should care genuinely because you should want to do what they do. But I didn't join Chronosphere because I love observability, which by the way, that's what we do. We're an observability tech company. I didn't even know what observability was. I joined the company because I had a really good friend here and I had a very honest and very blunt conversation with her about the fact that I was hurt. I was scarred. I was jaded and I was mad about the experiences that I'd had in recruiting over the pandemic and even before that. And I was just asking the blunt questions of like, are you going to respect me? Right. And maybe don't ask it that bluntly. I had a good friend that I could be very blunt with in that moment, but you need to figure out, is this company going to respect my time? Think about how they talk to you in emails. Think about how they approach you in the interview process. Think about how they answer the questions that you ask, right? When you ask about culture, are they just saying what's in the job description and what's on their career page, or are they giving you a genuine answer, right? If they're not giving you a genuine answer, why aren't they giving you a genuine answer? Do they not know? Or are they trying to hide the fact that it's not so good? So don't only ask about things like culture or work-life balance or work-life harmony, however you want to approach it, or about comp, or about all of these very important underlying factors of a job. Don't only ask about them one time, and don't only ask the recruiter. Ask everybody that you interview. Take some time in every interview that you do or every sort of interaction you have with the company you're trying to approach, and ask about these things and form an opinion. Don't take, and I always tell people this, like, don't take my opinion on culture. I'm going to give you an incredibly biased, incredibly personal take on why I like this company. Take that and ask someone else the same question and build up your response, build up your answer, come to your own conclusion, because it's just, we have a good company. And I would love anybody who wants to work at a company that sort of respects them to come and take a look at Chronosphere. Maybe we'll be compelling you. Maybe we'll have something that lines up. Odds are maybe not. We have some very specific expectations, but give it a shot. But there are companies out there that exist like Chronosphere. And I would say that a lot of them are probably not as well known. There's a lot of companies that say they're the best place to work and are in fact the opposite. And something that everybody should know this, the top 20 places to work in the world or whatever, these lists that come out every single year, that's pay to play. The companies that are on that paid to be on that. Not saying they're bad companies to work for, not saying they're not good companies, but I'm saying you have to keep in mind that a lot of these things are pay to play and you need to do your own research. Don't just trust Glassdoor. Don't just trust the opinion of the recruiter. Don't just trust the opinion of this article from Built In or wherever who said that this company is the best place to work for in New York City, whatever. Build your own opinions, do your own research, talk to people, whether you're seeing bad things in Glassdoor or good things in Glassdoor. I've worked for amazing companies that have really bad Glassdoors, and I've worked for really bad companies that have really good Glassdoors, right? So it's a combination of facts. And I wish I could give a quick tip, but the reality of the situation is there's a lot of tears. There's a lot of angry nights and a lot of very upsetting situations that I had to go through to get to this point. And I had to learn it the hard way. And I hope that me telling you, do your research and don't take that opinion seriously, or don't take a single person's opinion seriously. I hope you take that lesson seriously because it took me a long time to get to that point. Right.
I particularly love the fact that, you're encouraging people just to make an opinion, but to ask a lot of questions, not just to one, but to get multiple perspectives, because depending on your situation, you might be desperate for a job. So first offer comes, you accept it, right? But depending on your situation, it's also important to kind of take some time, reflect, do some deep thinking on what you really like, what you really don't like, and just collect data by asking as many questions to as many people as possible, and just not rushing and only focusing on the basics like comp and work-life balance and all these buzzwords that,
and those things are important.
They
right?
are.
I want to highlight that, right? Like if you need a job, right? What I'm saying is still important because you want to know, hey, I'm going to take this job, but I know that there's some things off here. So I need to be careful about this area, or I need to be sort of conscious of this thing. And it applies to both sides, whether that be finding a good company or just finding a job and knowing what you're getting yourself into, There's nothing wrong with that?
No, there absolutely isn't. I forgot to ask, are you managing anybody now?
No, I actively moved away from that.
Oh.
I've managed people in the past. So what I tell people is my boss now, I used to have my boss's job at companies in the past, but I don't want that anymore. I just want to do my thing and I want to be good at it. And maybe there's a future where I'll do that again and I'm not opposed to it, but for now, no.
So it's kind of like a software engineer that has like 20, 30 years of experience, like, you know what? Still no management. I just want
I'm going down the principal path.
I love it.
Yeah, I've diverged. I'm going down the principal path.
We have a principal recruiter in the making, folks.
Yeah.
But Mitch, I just want to thank you again for your time. And I think a fitting way to kind of wrap this up is just ask you one more question. So for someone that wants to follow in your footsteps, that literally started from not knowing what recruiting was to now becoming someone who's worked at a lot of great tech companies and on the path to becoming a very successful rock star or principal recruiter one of these days. What is one advice that you give to someone who wants to be like a successful recruiter like you?
Embrace the land of misfit toys. I think this is something that I heard of very early in recruiting. Is some of the best recruiters I know have some of the weirdest hodgepodges of experience that you have, right? Recruiting is about empathy. Regardless if you're an agency recruiter or not, the best recruiters are the people that understand, right? Are the people that understand, why can't that hiring manager work with me? Why can't they take my candidates, right? Why does this candidate not want to look for a job right now? Why does this candidate need this specific thing? Embrace the fact that your job is changing people's lives. You're asking people to make fundamentally important life decisions for you to be successful, right? And that is a very, very important thing to hold close to your heart. You close a candidate, that person just changed the trajectory of their life. That's something you can't forget about, right? And that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? And that's not, it's not your place. It's not your responsibility for it to be a good or bad. Your job is to open that door and let them decide if they want to go through it. But you have to realize the importance of what we do, right? And then I think that is something that it took me a while to realize, because I sort of just treated it as, just get the job done, check the box, move on, etc. But the closer I get to realizing that, like, my job is not, I'm not just a service vertical. I am a subject matter expert. I understand people, right? I understand what people want. And I can understand why people don't want this and want this thing, or, vice versa, right? And I think if you want to follow my path, I would say, don't lose your empathy. Don't get too jaded. You will, but you don't, try not to. And let yourself make mistakes. This circles back to one of the things we talked about earlier. Don't focus on what you're meant to do. Do things and check things off the list. Don't focus on the needle in the haystack. Just focus on the hay. You'll find the needle eventually. But if you're just looking for the needle, it's gonna be a hell of a lot harder. That's my fun metaphor.
just hearing you talk gets me fired up being a recruiter, Mitch. Thank you for that perspective. And lastly, people want to reach out to you. People want to find you. Where can they find you?
LinkedIn, obviously. You've seen my LinkedIn. I don't take it super seriously. I have a slightly humorous LinkedIn, but my LinkedIn is, you just search me, Mitch Babineaux, MITCH BABINEAUX. I don't want to give out my work email because I have enough people emailing me as is. But if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to have a conversation. I can't promise an immediate response because I do have a lot of people trying to reach out to me, but I do respond to everybody that does reach out.
He's a hard man to get in touch with.
I'm so famous.
You're just too famous. I mean, it took us years to even just set up this podcast.
Desirable.
Oh my God. But I mean, Mitch,
I don't do social media though. I'm sorry, everybody. Only LinkedIn.
Only LinkedIn for now. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
The next big thing, I'll be on it.
Yeah, for sure. But Mitch, thank you so much. I mean, for someone that obviously had, I'm going to call it a privilege to first work with you when you first got into this industry about 7-8 years ago, to see you into the person and professional that you became today. Like, I'm honestly genuinely very happy and very proud for you. Like, you had quite a journey working at a lot of different companies, and you've done an exceptional job in carving out a space where you are clearly confident and happy in what you do. And that's what I wish for anyone.
Very lucky
in whatever job. So, and I can say, hopefully, like, I think you're my only person that I've worked with from Louisiana. Let's keep it that way.
Yeah, we'll keep it that way. No more.
Yeah.
Send them my way. I'll kick them out.
I will.
No
but for
friends
anyone,
allowed.
Yeah, exactly. But for those that are listening, if you want to get in touch with Mitch, please obviously reach out to him, and you can 100% spam him on my permission. Yeah. He'll gladly accept.
Spam me. But it won't change my day-to-day. That's how it works all the time.
But whether or not you want to ask him for his experience, or maybe you want to reach out, I know that Chronosphere is doing a lot of hiring. They're going to continue to do a lot of hiring in the future. Just real quick, what sort of positions are you hiring for? What sort of positions you think you might be hiring for in the future?
A lot of everything. Honestly, we had a very successful 2021 and continue to have a very successful 2022. So right now it's about having the people catch up to the business, right? We're in a very privileged spot as a company where the only thing that could go wrong is not hiring the right people. So we're hiring a lot of everything: sales, marketing, operations, IT, people. A little bit less on the recruiting, a little bit more passively, but you can still reach out whenever opposed to it. But most importantly, and I don't say this just because it's what I do, but product managers and designers. If you are an extremely technical product manager or designer, please reach out to me.
I
Obviously,
mean,
also engineers, but
with
we'll keep
you
those
and your
focused.
experience, Mitch, most likely whoever does reach out will probably have a phenomenal experience with you, which is
I hope
honestly the
so.
most important thing. So, but honestly, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing a lot of your insights and experiences and just like the raw kind of insight that you were able to kind of go through all these different types of companies and your perspective between agency and in-house. I certainly found it very valuable and humorous and entertaining. And I know that people that are listening probably found the same too. So I wish you nothing but tremendous success moving forward. I can't wait until I get that notification on LinkedIn saying that Mitch is now a principal recruiter. I'm going to hold you to it. It's going to happen. We're wishing it into the universe, into the stars. And again, for anyone that wants to reach out to you guys, know where to find him. But Mitch, thank you so much again for making time. I really appreciate it. And I hope you continue to crush it this year and next year. And we'll certainly keep in touch and do some, hopefully cross paths sometime soon again.
I hope so. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.